One of the things that stuck out for me the most when reading an autobiography of Malcolm X was the sense of compression in the book. Malcolm X only lived to be 39 years old. He was 39 when he was assassinated. And there's so much that happened in his life. There's so many different lives that it feels like he lived. And this book was written and finalized as the walls were closing in on him. And so there's a deep sense that this is his last testament. This is the last thing he's going to be able to say to the world. And there's this sense of urgency, this deep sense of urgency. The book opens with Malcolm describing to us his childhood growing up in Lansing, Michigan. His father was a preacher in the tradition of Marcus Garvey, and his family was on the receiving end of a lot of racial violence. At one point, the KKK, I believe, or other racists set fire to his home. His father died a violent death. I think Malcolm grew up with 6 or 7 siblings. I don't remember the exact number. And there was not enough food in the house. He describes, the kids were dizzy with hunger. Malcolm had to go out and shoot rabbits to just have the most basic anything to eat. He talks about how growing up he learned that the squeaky wheel gets the grease, so to speak, that to get what he wanted, to get food instead of his siblings, he had to be the loudest and the most persistent and insistent child of all his siblings. And through his just loudness and persistence, he was able to get more food than his siblings. His parents were violent. His father was violent to his mother. His mother was violent to the kids, and violent towards Malcolm. And eventually, when Malcolm was very young, his mother suffered a nervous breakdown and had to be hospitalized. And Malcolm and his siblings bounced around between foster homes. In school, Malcolm was delinquent for a while, and he ended up being sent away to a kind of reformatory. And at that point, Malcolm's 12, 13 years old, something begins to shift. And he starts doing incredibly well in this all-white 7th grade middle school where he's sent to. And he's taken in by a white family that sort of ran this reformatory, and they love him and they're proud of him. And Malcolm is excelling at school and getting great grades, and he's beloved. And it's an all-white school. He's like the only black kid in the entire school. And he gets elected class president, probably because of his, charisma and his oratory skills that he's starting to exude at this young age. But he describes never really feeling comfortable in that environment. He's never really seen as fully human, as fully equal in that environment. He recounts a very formative moment when he confesses to a teacher that he respected and a teacher that really cared for him that he aspires to maybe one day be a lawyer. And the teacher sort of laughed mockingly and said, listen, you have to be realistic. Maybe you could be a great carpenter or something. And eventually, Malcolm visits his half-sister in Boston, Massachusetts. And when he's there, he just happens to taste some of the black nightlife that existed at the time. Bars where there was music being played and a community of black people, of course, completely different from his own experience in Michigan. And he decides that he has to leave, that he can't stay, that his heart is with his community. He can only be free. He can only be himself in his own community among these people because he doesn't feel fully seen, fully human in this white environment. And so he comes back home to his foster parents, very withdrawn, very reserved, and everyone's wondering, what's going on, Malcolm? Why are you not your usual self? What happened? What can we do for you? And he eventually makes clear that he intends to leave. And there's this dramatic moment in the book where everyone in his life, his foster parents, they're crying. They're so heartbroken because they really loved him and they were really proud of him. And Malcolm is stoic because he knows that this is not his home. This is not his place. He grows up extremely fast. He drops out of school after the 9th grade. And over time, he ends up in New York City, in Harlem. An amazing part of this book is the history of New York City, the history of Harlem in the 50s and 60s. And the cultural resurgence that happened there, the relationship between the black community and the white people that would come to enjoy the nightlife. He describes all sorts of sexual extravagances that were going on at the time among wealthy people who coming in and out of Harlem. And he gets enmeshed in that culture. Some of the most exciting chapters, he's describing that nightlife that he is attracted to, and the dancing and the costumes, the zoot suits that he describes. It's like interesting, this amazing subculture. He paints these pictures very vividly. And eventually, as time goes on, he's very young, but he looks much older, and he's treated like an adult, basically, even though he's a kid. He ends up being pulled in, finding himself drawn into a life of crime. He starts, doing sort of jobs, menial jobs, but some of these jobs require hooking people up with prostitutes, for example, or running gambling numbers, and over time he's drawn into this underworld, and it builds and builds to a crescendo. At one point, he's eventually just doing larceny, like armed robberies. One of the most dramatic moments in the book is when he's very close to getting caught and very close to ending up in prison, and he's more reckless and more violent and more dangerous than he's ever been. He's with a group of fellow thieves that he's working with to rob upper wealthy homes, and he tells them none of us could be afraid to die. And he takes a gun, he puts a bullet in the chamber, one bullet in the chamber, he spins it, and he puts the gun to his head, and everyone's saying, don't do it, and he pulls the trigger, and he makes the point, I'm not afraid to die. Like, no one here can be afraid to die, to do what we need to do. And of course, that's an extremely dramatic moment in the history of Malcolm X's life. And amazingly, that scene recurs again in the epilogue of the book, when Alex Haley describes the process of the writing that he did with Malcolm X. And he says that after the book was, finishing up, when they were getting towards the end, Malcolm X confided in Alex Haley that he actually palmed the bullet. So meaning he was bluffing. It wasn't really a Russian roulette. There wasn't really a bullet in the chamber. But he told Alex Haley, you have to keep the story as it is. You can't change that story, because I don't want people to think nowadays that I'm someone who bluffs. I don't want to come off as someone who doesn't mean what they say. So anyway, he ends up getting arrested and serving, I think, a 10-year prison sentence. At first, in prison, he's very confrontational. He's getting, beaten up by the guards and very obstinate. But his brother gets him interested in this new emerging religious movement, the Nation of Islam, and he becomes attracted to the teachings of Elijah Muhammad, the founder of the Nation of Islam, and he ends up becoming obsessed with learning and reading books, opening his mind. Nation of Islam is a very sort of ascetic kind of religious philosophy, so there's no indulging in any vices, and he spends his time just reading. He describes in great detail, one of the most exciting chapters, parts of the book for me, and for any, I think, book lover really, is when he describes the world of literature, the world of books opening up to him. And he describes becoming completely engrossed and not even minding being in solitary confinement, because that's when he had the most time to read. And he describes how at nighttime, when they had lights out, there was maybe some like exit sign or something in the hallway, some little glimmer of light where if he just positioned himself right and he gave time for his eyes to adjust, he was able to make out words of his books. And of course, this damaged his eyes, and he's known famously to have worn glasses after later in life because he damaged his eyes reading in the dark all those years. He describes how after lights out, the guard would pass by once every hour, and he had to be in bed when the guard passed by. So he was only able to read 55 minutes out of every hour at night, because for 5 minutes he had to pretend to be sleeping. But this way he was able to read 15 hours a day, he says, and he describes all the books that he read, philosophy books and history books. And what is inspiring him the most and what's speaking to him the most is the history of colonialism, the history of the brutality of the white man. He starts seeing through this lens of white people being evil, exploitative, plundering the earth, and enslaving and plundering peoples of color. When he comes out of prison, he quickly rises to be one of the most powerful and important people in the Nation of Islam. When he just joined the Nation of Islam, maybe he had a few hundred people total in the entire religion, and Malcolm X manages to grow it to tens of thousands of people. And through his charisma and his passion, he's able to proselytize, to recruit, and he speaks eloquently and powerfully about the evil of the white man and about the lost legacy of black people, the sense in which they've been stripped of their identities, they've been stripped of their dignity, they've been stripped of their history, and this need to reclaim their history and their identity. Malcolm X writes very powerfully about the communal work that he was involved in, that the Nation of Islam was involved in. He describes, he's very proud of the work they did with drug addiction. And he describes a process which to me, to my ears, as a non-expert, sounds very, very similar to Alcoholics Anonymous, process he used to get people sober, that his community, his church used, or his temple, they call it, the temple used to get people sober and off of drugs. And this idea that black people who were living life of drug abuse or living lives of crime were living beneath their dignity. They had to reclaim their dignity as human beings, as black people, and rise above all that. And that was his mission. And he was so good, and he was infinitely dedicated to Elijah Muhammad, who was the leader of the Nation of Islam. At the time, he would also get very heavily criticized, certainly as an alternative vision of civil rights when compared to people like Martin Luther King, for example, who preached nonviolence. Malcolm X, on the other hand, preached a defensive violence. He said, if someone steps on my toes, I will step on your toes. If you're going to attack me, I'm going to attack you. There was incidents during those years in the 60s of race riots, and Malcolm X got the reputation by the police, by the community, as someone who could start a riot because he was so powerful in the community. Also, the reputation of someone who could stop a riot. And so the FBI opened a dossier on him. The Nation of Islam was starting to become infiltrated, and people were recognizing and calling out Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam for being hateful, a kind of hate group, a belief in black superiority. At the time, Malcolm X is a black supremacist. He believes in segregation. He believes in separatism. He's against intermarriage. He's against the mixing of the races. And he says some very inflammatory things. He's able to offend a lot of people. He says things that sound hateful. He says a lot of things that sound very anti-Semitic. He says things that sound extremely callous to the death of innocent white people, for example. And so he's this hugely polarizing figure. And now we're getting towards maybe the last quarter or so, last 25% of the book. And this is when things start to really heat up in the autobiography, and get really interesting. Because at this point, towards the end of Malcolm X's life, he starts becoming disillusioned with the Nation of Islam. He learns about sexual indiscretions by Elijah Muhammad, and meanwhile, Elijah Muhammad is becoming very jealous of Malcolm X and his power. Malcolm X gets rebuked for some statements that he said about the Kennedy assassination. He said something, coming home to roost or something. He made some statement which sounded sort of dismissive of the assassination, which of course stirred up a lot of backlash in the press. And Elijah Muhammad used this as a pretext to ban Malcolm X from any public appearances for, I think, 90 days. And this was a huge blow to the one thing that made him happy, the one thing that made him give him purpose in life. That was taken away from him, and also to his dignity, to his respect, to sort of be sort of cut down like that, publicly humiliated by Elijah Muhammad. And over time, over this process, and this process is sort of being covered live. This autobiography is being written as this is happening. He breaks from the Nation of Islam. He breaks from Elijah Muhammad. And you have to understand, you cannot imagine how dedicated Malcolm X was to Elijah Muhammad. Until this point in his life, since he came out of prison, everything he said, he always prefaced with, this is just me being a mouthpiece for Elijah Muhammad. Everything he said was, for example, when he went to the Alex Haley, who he worked with on collecting this autobiography, he told Alex Haley, all the proceeds from this book in the contract need to be belong to the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad. He didn't want any proceeds. The house he lived in belonged to the Nation of Islam. And he lived a life of austerity, because that's basically what his religion preached. And he was so poor in a way. He looked well off, but everything was from the Nation of Islam. And once that was cut off from him, he had basically nothing. In this moment of extreme turmoil, extreme inner struggle, you get the sense that Malcolm X, originally Malcolm Little, is this orphan, lived a tragic childhood, no father to speak of in his life. And he was attracted to Elijah Muhammad as the apotheosis of a father figure, someone that he worshipped. And to lose that was such a trauma, such a blow. And suddenly now there's also death threats. His family, he feels unsafe for his family. At one point, his house gets firebombed. And because people in the Nation of Islam start to see him as an enemy now. And in this moment of extreme turmoil and uncertainty, he becomes more attracted to Sunni Islam, and he decides to go on Hajj to Mecca. And he describes in such amazing cinematic detail the experience of being a black man traveling to Mecca in Saudi Arabia and not speaking Arabic, and being just a foreigner in an alien land, and having his eyes opened, his mind opened to a world where race isn't the most important thing. He's taken in by someone, he writes, that from the look of it, was totally white, but there was no racial difference between them. And this completely changes his worldview and shakes his perspective. And he has a very positive experience. He ends up meeting with world leaders. He meets with leaders of African countries and Arab countries. And all this, by the way, is on borrowed money from his stepsister, because he has nothing. But eventually he comes back home a changed man, and the press wants to interview him and understand how he's changed. He's doing these press conferences. At one point he takes the question of, are you still against intermarriage between the races? And he says no. He says, I've changed. I think we're all human beings now, and his views evolve. When he was asked on January 19th about his views on intermarriage, Malcolm X said, I believe in recognizing every human being as a human being, neither white, black, brown, or red. And when you are dealing with humanity as a family, there's no question of integration or intermarriage. It's just one human being marrying another human being, or one human being living around and with another human being. I may say, though, that I don't think it should ever be put upon a black man And I don't think the burden to defend any position should ever be put upon the black man, because it is the white man collectively who has shown that he is hostile toward integration and toward intermarriage and toward these other strides toward oneness. So as a black man, and especially as a black American, any stand that I formally took, I don't think that I would have to defend it, because it's still a reaction to the society. And it's a reaction that was produced by the society. And I think that it is the society that produced this that should be attacked, not the reaction that develops among the people who are victims of that negative society. And that was Malcolm's ideology and the vision that he expressed to the end. He always saw himself as holding up a mirror to society. That the hatred, the anger that fueled him throughout his life and his career was a reflection and a mirroring back of the hatred that he was on the receiving end of. An example earlier on in the book, again, when he's taking accusations, he's responding to accusations of being a black supremacist, of being a hateful person. He says, for the white man to ask the black man if he hates him is just like the rapist asking the raped, or the wolf asking the sheep, do you hate me? The white man is in no moral position to accuse anyone else of hate. Why, when all of my ancestors are snake-bitten, and I'm snake-bitten, and I warn my children to avoid snakes, what does that snake sound like accusing me of hate teaching? So that's how he would respond to these accusations of hate teaching. He always saw himself as just holding up a mirror. The autobiography ends with, very broad-minded, profound ideas with a sense of urgency, like they're being written very quickly, of Malcolm X's sort of new worldview, his modified worldview, his expanded worldview about universal humanity, about the fact that the reason we even think in racial terms is constructed, is a product of white society, of European society in which he grew up in. And at that point, the autobiography ends, and we know as readers, from the epilogue of this book, or just readers of American history, that shortly afterwards he was assassinated while giving a lecture. And so his life and his story, I think, is gripping. The way this autobiography is written, the way it's told, I think, is gripping. It raises, deep questions about reverse racism. What is racism? What is hate? As part of this transformation that Malcolm X undergoes from inside to outside the Nation of Islam, in the beginning, towards the middle of the book, he tells a story where, again, he's giving these fiery speeches to these crowds about the injustice of the African Americans in America, how much they've been persecuted by the whites. And he gains the respect of plenty of white people as well, of course, who are attracted to, who want to help, basically. And he tells a story of a young girl, college girl, who came up to him after one of his talks and said, what can I do to help? And Malcolm X said, there's nothing you can do to help. You can donate money to our cause. And she basically left crying. And he says towards the end of the book that he so regrets that interaction. And he wishes he could somehow find that girl and reach out to her, because he thinks that the struggle is for everyone, and that she should connect with people in her own community and fight racism in her own community. That really, it is a struggle that everyone is engaged in and everyone has a role in. When I think back at the biography, this story of this life, when I reflect on the life lived, this short life, this compressed life, this life that went through these phases, that each phase could be a whole human life, so to speak. It speaks to the way in which human beings can change and evolve over time, that we're not fixed. There's redemption for criminals, for example. Malcolm X speaks beautifully, towards the end of the book, when he summarizes himself what he wants readers to get out of this biography. He says he wants readers to see the ways in which options are limited, curtailed for a whole community of people, for millions of people growing up in America, where there's no choice almost. but to fall into a life of crime. He talks about one of his friends that he worked with, a bookie, responsible for the gambling that they were doing with numbers. Who they didn't want to keep slips on them, because if they were caught with gambling slips, police could arrest them. There was someone who could remember any number, all the numbers. He had some photographic memory, and Malcolm mourns. What if this person had opportunities to do something other than just memorize gambling numbers? He could have been an important person, a luminary, a contributor to society. But this is all the options that he had. And I think of Malcolm X, Malcolm Little, someone who endured unimaginable trauma as a child, trauma that would have shattered any normal person. But because of some incredible inner strength, some incredible courage, was able to overcome, and he was constantly searching and seeking for his identity and his freedom, for his purpose, and just freedom is the word that comes to mind. And so when he was doing well in that white school and loving foster parents, he knew that he would never be free there. And when normal people would have said, this is all I have, and this is safe and stable, he had the courage to leave it behind him and to walk away from it into the abyss, into the unknown. And he found success in the criminal world. And then when he was in prison, he writes how prison was the greatest gift for him. He found redemption in prison. He found a new life in prison, and in knowledge, and in books, and in religion. And again, being able to shake off his past, being able to walk away and change and transform himself, reinvent himself, for the sake of a better world, a better life. And his final struggle, his final battle, the infinitely unimaginable, painful struggle that he had to fight, was overcoming his attachment to the Nation of Islam, where he was so committed, so infinitely attached and subservient to Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam and what that represented. And at the end of his life, he had to walk away from it. He became disillusioned, and he had the courage to say, I was wrong. I gave 12 years of my life, and it was a mistake. And he said that literally to his autobiographer, to the press. He walked away from it. And that ultimate act of unimaginable courage, of changing his view, of telling the press, it gets in the autobiography, but it's in his public statements at the time, I changed my mind, I changed my views on these issues, ultimately cost him his life.